They don't tell you squat, for Christ's sake.
Don't tell everybody that.
Oh, okay.
All right, at that point, here we might as well get started while we freaked everybody out. Welcome back. If you haven't been here before, welcome. We do this pretty much every Wednesday at 11 o'clock. It's been a really, really cool thing for us to do. You kind of get to see behind the scenes a little bit. And then you kind of can ask your questions and raise your hand if you have something to add, or if you have a specific question that you want answered. I would welcome you to raise your hand or put a question in the chat feature. And to that point, I've already got the first question. Buyer's realtor has a signed buyer brokerage agreement for 1%, but the seller offers 2.5%. What will happen? Dad, talk to me. What happens? What do we need to do?
That's 1%. That's it.
Well, what else is there? I mean, number one, that's excellent.
Well, it's not effective yet. If we have a sales contract today or before the effective date of this settlement, you can get the extra money. But if it's after the effective date, I would say no.
Well, let's start even simpler than that. I will commend everyone for having a buyer brokerage agreement signed, right? So that is the first step. A buyer asks you, will you help me find a house? You say, yes, I'd be honored. Here's what I charge. Please sign the buyer brokerage agreement. That's where it starts. So, Regine, in that scenario, you did the best thing by protecting yourself up front. You agreed to 1%, and that is what you're willing to accept for your services. And hopefully you're thrilled about that. In fact, the fact that the seller is offering more, you have two options. Dad, in your mind, what are you? I mean, maybe you have three options, right? You mentioned the first option, nothing. You will get the 1%, and then
the 1%,
and then that is what it is.
The last show, you suggested just amending the buyer broker's agreement.
All right, so that's option number two. So option number two, you could amend your buyer brokerage agreement. Dad, you and I, we've actually looked into this quite a bit because it's not entirely clear. What did you determine on?
I can't find anything on it, Christian. And you have that nebulous language in the settlement agreement that talks about they're going to be keeping an eye on workarounds. I mean, what's the point of having a buyer broker's agreement where you can't get more than what's in the buyer broker agreement, when all you have to do is amend it 5 minutes later and get that extra?
Well, so what are you saying in that case? You telling
I'm
people
saying it's
amended, or
a lot of this stuff is going to be determined by cases of first impression, because it is simply not clear from the settlement agreement.
Yeah, so what, ultimately, I think everyone will have to make a decision, and I would tell you that you'll have to confirm with your broker. Absent your broker's opinion, I would tell you that it's undetermined whether you can amend your buyer brokerage agreement. The settlement does not discuss it. I think it would be legally valid under contract law. If you agree to this and then they amend it and buyer and the agent agree to that amendment, contractually you have a valid contract, but per your agreement with NAR and your broker, will you be able to then accept more? We think so. We think that you can amend it. It seems that at NABOR earlier, I think maybe it was last week, there were specialists talking to this point that they said they do believe you're allowed to accept an amended buyer brokerage agreement. But again, I think if you're going to amend your buyer brokerage agreement, confirm with your broker first.
Yes.
Make sure that they will still pay out when they see that the amendment came after the original buyer brokerage agreement.
And my general attitude is if the settlement agreement doesn't say you can't, the inference is you can.
Or the inference is, revert to contract law.
Right? The contract law as it exists right now says you can do it.
Yeah.
This settlement agreement is not effective yet. The effective date is defined in the settlement agreement. We're not there yet. It is within the realm of possibility that they could be kicked back to the table to renegotiate the settlement. Department of Justice has that right. Sometime in November, possibly. So if it doesn't say no, consult with the broker. And right now, under existing law, under 475 and all that, you can amend it.
Yeah, we think you can amend it as long as your broker allows you to. If they feel differently, well, they're the ones paying you. At the end of the day, the commission is paid to the broker, and then the broker distributes based on your agreement with them. So they really matter in this case, because they're, at the end of the day, they are the compliance department. They're the ones that are, are they willing to take that risk or not? How do they interpret their agreement with you, or their agreement with NAR? So the third option, and people have mentioned this in the comments, what happens to the excess? That's the third option. Is, all right, number one, you take less. Number two, you just amend it to the full 2.5. Or number three, you say, all right, I'm not going to amend it, but now I know that built into the price, the seller was expecting 1.5% extra in credits or concessions. So
Right.
let's make sure my buyer gets that, right? So when I make
Offer
my
less
offer,
money. You just
when I
offer
make,
less
well,
money.
you could offer less money, or you could ask for 1.5% in credits or commissions, or not
Yeah.
commissions, but
Buyer can
credits
say,
towards closing costs. So that's what I would do with the excess, is if they're willing to give you that insight, you then take that into effect. You're like, all right, does that make my offer stronger? Or do I ask for that and then it's still technically a full price offer? So yeah, those are your three options. 1, 2, 3. I think they're all valid. I think they'd be fine. Just double check with your broker. I've said this a lot. When people call me and we tend to talk about their concerns and how this is going to work, the one thing that I want people to understand is that it is hard to amend a buyer brokerage agreement with your buyer.
yes,
It's a difficult conversation. And as much as you think that it could be simple, or that your client really understands you and they'll want you to take advantage of this, it's an opportunity for them to kind of say, well, why don't I get that? Or
they're
why
gonna
don't I?
want a part of it, no matter, and I would just think.
Yeah, it's something that, like, if I, if I tell you I'm going to charge you $1,000, and then they find out, well, actually I'm going to charge you two, but don't worry, it's not going to cost you anything. They're going to ask why, how,
Yeah.
what are my options? Why don't I get that? Why can't I just offer less? Why is that? You and I already agreed to something. So don't underestimate how difficult it may be to amend a buyer brokerage agreement. I was in a conversation with a really good realtor, someone that I respect a lot. And he was telling me, he said, well, I think it's going to be super easy if we go to a new construction community and they, let's say I already have a buyer brokerage agreement at a certain amount. And then the builder, the new construction builder, is offering double that. He's like, I think it'll be super simple for me to go and just amend the agreement. Buyer will understand. And then 10 minutes later, he said, well, I just don't do buyer brokerage agreements right now. They're too hard to get signed. Buyers always fight me on it. They have 1,000 questions. And I said, hey, listen to yourself. It's not easy. It's not, you told me it's not easy, but you also told me it's super easy. He goes, oh, you're right. You're right. Oh no. So I think that is my expectation. Think of it like you're hiring a plumber and they tell you it's $1,600 for the water heater. And then the plumber says, hey, the manufacturer is offering a $500 credit to me, but you have to sign this for me to get it. And they say, well,
Yeah.
why don't I get it? Can't we split it? Can't you, like, why is that not my discount? I think that's a really good analogy.
They always have builder discounts. When I did the painting through law school, I got builder's discount. I just didn't tell the client.
Yeah,
And
imagine if you
NAR,
tried to keep it for yourself and you needed the client to sign off on that.
well,
It's like,
realistically, it affected what I would do the job for, honestly.
I know, but we're finding it out after the fact, right? That it's a
Yeah,
challenge. That's a challenging conversation. That's my point. It's a challenging
I
conversation.
was telling a realtor a few minutes ago that some of this stuff, their clients should be hearing from them now rather than later. You don't want to have somebody going to the closing table, say a seller, and seeing, the listing agent getting 6% and the selling agent getting 3 for a total of 9. It's
Yeah,
like
so
if one,
we have to talk about that. So, there's a lot going on, and I want to, maybe we can get to that in a minute.
okay,
Because here's the other scenario. Those are your three scenarios. And so someone asked, what happens to the excess commission that the seller has agreed to pay the buyer broker over the buyer broker compensation. All right, so this is a little tricky because there are a couple of different scenarios where this could happen. And again, I would talk to your broker because ultimately they are going to be very important to make sure that you're getting paid. The first thing to understand is that you will not get paid more than your buyer broker agreement states. That is a hard and fast rule. You will not ever
Right.
get paid more than what your buyer broker agreement says. That's the first thing to understand. So if your buyer broker agreement says 1 and the contract says 3 and the listing agreement says 3, and so at closing, Ross Title sends you a check made out to the broker, and the broker gets a check for 3, and then they check the buyer brokerage agreement and says 1, the broker has a problem because they can't pay you more than 1, but they have a check for 3. So what do they do with the excess 2 at that point? They can't keep it. They can't distribute it. Maybe they go to the buyer and say, hey, let's split it, or hey, this goes back to you, or they send it back to me at Ross Title, which point maybe I give that to the seller. Maybe I give that to the listing broker. It's confusing. This is really hard. Don't let that happen. That's the simple answer. Don't let that happen because it'll cause an issue. So that leads to the thing you're talking about, Dad. Let's assume the scenario, and I'm sorry if we're going too fast. We'll have to slow down maybe. Let's assume the scenario that the listing agreement says 6 and that they'll split half of it with the buyer's agent, if there is one.
If there is one.
If there is one. So buyer comes through and says, I'm going to make an offer. I'm going to lowball this guy, but I'm not going to ask for them to pay any of the compensation. I'll handle that separately. So you and the buyer broker, or the buyer and the buyer broker agree to a certain, let's say it's 3. The listing agent says, their agreement says 6. The contract doesn't ask for any compensation to the buyer broker. You could potentially have a scenario where the listing broker got 6.
Yes.
The full amount, because that's what the listing agreement says. And then the buyer gets 3.
Yes.
That could happen. And that would be contractually allowed. It would be allowed under the NAR settlement. I could see that being a problem. I could see a seller being pretty upset. You probably want to think that through if that really does happen. You don't want to be surprised by it at closing. And but if I could see certain people saying, all right, I'm owed the full 6. That was my agreement.
You don't want your seller hearing it from us, the closers, first. They should hear it from you. And I've seen a lot of listing agents in the past, if they had both sides of the deal, they might take 5 instead of 6.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's some indication of sharing the wealth, so to speak.
Yeah, so and that leads to, how do you inform your sellers of all these changes and whether you do inform them or not. And I'll give you a little bit of sneak peek behind the scenes. At NAR, they are coming out with a disclosure. And this disclosure will basically be given to all people that have signed listing agreements and tell them about these changes. And it says specifically that the MLS will no longer be allowed. They will be prohibited from disclosing a cooperation split.
Right.
And that you have to have a buyer brokerage agreement signed before showing the house. That's what this disclosure will say. So that's the opportunity for you to get it in front of the seller and say, hey, you may read about this in the newspaper. Maybe you already have, but here's how it's going to work. And here's how I'm accommodating this going forward. And as you know, it does say, that it's this, and I split half of it with the buyer broker. So, there was a lot of fighting between, do we amend listing agreements or can we just send them a disclosure? It looks like they're going the disclosure route. That should be approved very soon. So that'll be one form that you can do with all your listings. Email them a copy of this disclosure, tell them they can reach out to you with questions, and then you just kind of have to be proactive. Dad, we had heard about this, that FAR and NAR were saying that you could do amended buyer brokerage agreements. And Rick Baranski, thank you for confirming that, because he's saying the same thing. Now, I don't know if anyone's put that in writing, and the first lawsuit will really determine how that is up.
I haven't found it, and you have the workaround language in the settlement agreement, so God knows what the Department of Justice will do with it. But you do have a lot of situations where people get involved with a buyer broker and they don't understand the full extent of how hard that person's going to be working and how many hours he's putting into the deal, and their perception of how much that person is worth increases through the process. So there's a lot of justification for it. They might start out just, with you preparing the offer and they think it's going to be a piece of cake. And then they find out it's really a fist fight.
Yep, totally. So Joyce, Joyce is a great agent here in town, but she also does a lot up in New Jersey. And she says, in New Jersey, you only get what is in your agreement, but they seem to think you could put in the terms and conditions in the contract, basically, modifying that. Can you put an escalation clause in your buyer agreement? I'll let you try and answer that one first, Dev.
I don't think it's ascertainable. I mean, I think it would
Well, tell us where that comes from. What is that?
It's page 29 of the settlement agreement. They have a prohibition against the buyer agent getting compensation as much as the seller is willing to pay. But they use that as an example. They give
so the NAR
buyer broker compensation shall not be whatever the amount the seller is offering to the buyer. That is not allowed under the settlement agreement. That's one place where they're specific.
Yeah, so they want us to be very specific about what we charge. And the concern would be if you put an escalation clause that it kind of defeats that. It doesn't follow that agreement. So I would say confirm with your broker before including an escalation clause, and understand that if you do it that way, ultimately the risk is that they could try and void your buyer brokerage agreement. They could say, hey, this wasn't specific and ascertainable. So that it's a little risky. It is risky that you do that. Like I've had a lot of people say that they want to put a certain amount, but if the seller is offering more, then we get to take more. That's certainly not okay.
Right.
I would say confirm with your broker if you were going to put something that's like, all right, it's this up, but if, as much as this, if these certain conditions apply, like imagine the scenario where it's like, if this agreement lasts for more than 12 months, then I charge more, or then I charge less. I don't know. I think it's risky. And I wouldn't want to be the guinea pig on that.
Charged by the hour. I mean, that the buyer will pay $100 an hour, for example, to the selling agent. I mean, you could go that route, but
is that specific and ascertainable?
It's risky. It's risky, and nobody wants to track of their hours. I hated it when I was, in another law firm. It was a pain in the rear end.
Yeah, and hopefully you guys are seeing the chat. There are people that are saying they took the NAR classes and that they've all confirmed that they are seeing that you can do an amendment to the buyer brokerage agreement. So that's good. Again, they'll change their tune like that if there's a lawsuit. So let's see what Rick asked a question. What is our opinion of the length of a buyer brokerage agreement? I saw a proposed buyer brokerage agreement from Sarasota that was 4 pages long of legalized print, very difficult to understand. What is our opinion? So I have a strong opinion about this. All these brokers that are trying to, what was that?
I have 2 opinions.
Yeah, I have quite a few opinions. So there are a lot of brokers out there that are really pushing for a specific buyer brokerage agreement that is tailored to their agents, that is simple and easy to understand and easy to propose. I don't like that. It's not my favorite because honestly, we don't do that with the sales contract. Sales contract is 12 pages, 13 pages long. And then when you throw on the addenda, it can be 20, 30, 40 pages long. At the end of the day, they are that long for a reason. There's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of things that they need to address. I always think about a contract as your conversation with your client or your customer. And if you don't have that conversation, it needs to be in writing. You could have a real problem. So, but there are several things that some of the brokers just don't like about the NAR and FAR bar buyer brokerage agreement. Specifically, one of them is the lien. So it
Yeah,
basically says that one of the remedies for a broker is that they can put a lien on the buyer's property or properties, wherever and whenever, if the buyer is found to be in default. And it's honestly, it's already in the listing agreement. No one seems to fight us on the listing agreement.
it's
I think we make it
there.
into more of a thing than it is.
I mean, in the past, Christian, when some New York lawyer would object to that, I would look at it and okay it, as long as there was mutual remedies in the contract. I said, it's fine. I explained to the selling agent or the listing agent the repercussions of that. It might be hard to chase this person for money if all their assets are in New York, using that hypothetical, but that agreement can be amended by a lawyer or by the clients. You just want to understand the significance of it.
Yeah, so if you had a buyer that was fighting you on that lien language or the remedies language, don't cross it out yourself. That's something that's going to have to go to your broker to modify, and the broker's going to, or you'll have to have an attorney to get involved. And
Yeah.
basically, you can modify these. If the brokers want to have like something that's pre-approved, hey, here's a modified version without lien rights, and this is the one with it, maybe you could do that. But generally, I like using the forms. The forms are tried and true. You're not, you're operating inside your box.
Right.
Think of it like medical malpractice. If a patient, has a terrible result from something that is tried and true, there's no medical malpractice claim. It's easily defended against. But if the doctor is going outside the normal practice and there's a bad result, they're going to get nailed to the wall. So I like using the standard forms. If there's forms available, use them. If the broker has, language that's pre-approved, use it. But stick to what the forms are generally. I think it's a much safer business practice.
The nice thing about the longer form is that it outlines specifically what the realtor is going to do. So it shows to the client, look at all this stuff I have to do. And then it goes on to show all the things that the client is supposed to do. His responsibility to turn over leads. If somebody asks about the property, you have to give it to your broker. So it's a nice way of starting the conversation about your value in the process.
Yeah.
This is not just me getting you to sign a contract and then going to the closing table. Look at all this BS I have to do. It's listed right here in the longer listing. The flip side, which I've heard some people argue, is they're more apt to sign something that's one page. But then you're gonna have to deal with all those issues. What is your value? What are you bringing to the table? What is the client supposed to be doing? Are they supposed to be referring people to you? Are they supposed to be doing other things? Are they supposed to be making the property safe if you have a showing? All the things that are nicely laid out in the NAR listing agreement.
I think a 3 or 4 page buyer brokerage agreement is not that big a deal. But if your broker does move to a 1 or 2 page agreement, that would be fine too. I just don't think it's going to change much. Rick's other question in there was, what should the length of the buyer brokerage agreement be? And my advice there is it should be probably 12 months. That's where I'd start. Think similarly to a listing agreement. The listing agreement, 3 months is too short a lot of times. 6 months, maybe, but 12 months is ideal. And, I would start at 12. And if the buyer says, oh my gosh, that's such a long agreement, then I would probably have one of 2 responses. I'd come down to 6 or 9 months, or I'd say, hey, look, if you and I stop working together, if this isn't working, then we will just rip up this agreement. Don't even worry about it. And it kind of even says that in the buyer brokerage agreement that, the broker has certain duties and the buyer has certain duties. If you guys just stop talking, it's just not working, and you're just going to walk away. The only time that you're really trying to enforce that agreement is when you make an offer on a property and you want to get paid for it, or
Right.
number 2, the buyer's trying to cut you out of the deal. That's when you're using it. But if you guys just start kind of going separate, you're just going to rip it up and say, don't even worry about that. We'll just We'll mutually terminate it. It won't be that big a deal, and you'll go move on with what you need to do.
You want to have a long protection period. If you have a 1 week term to buy a broker's agreement, have a long protection period and document the blazes out of properties, of people you've showed the property to, because those agreements talk about who's the procuring cause.
Yeah.
So you get into a big procuring cause thing, which is in our NAR manual. We got 3 or 4 pages on that.
Yeah.
Uh,
So Krista has a lot of great questions, and I'm trying to get to all of them. She's got some wonderful points.
This our 3 banana agent.
No. If you use the FAR bar listing agreement, can you use the NAR disclosures? It's a different topic, but yeah, you could. We usually like to use the disclosures for the contract you expect to receive. So for example, if you're in Lee County and you like the NAR listing agreement, but you expect to get a FAR bar contract, then having FAR bar riders is the most important. I think that makes more sense than using the NAR addenda for HOA or the condo stuff. I would, and if you're not sure, then have the disclosures for all of it. And that way you can kind of protect against it. Krista also asks, can you use a range on the buyer brokerage agreement, from 2 to 3% based on what the seller is offering? I really would stay away from that. And
I don't think you can do that.
My best advice, number one, we don't know if you can do it, but two, I think you have to address buyer brokerage agreements in the same way we do listing agreements. In a listing agreement, there's no range. It's just what you charge. That's what it is.
The language, whatever the seller is offering, is specifically prohibited in this settlement agreement.
Yeah. Bridget says, is the new NAR seller broker agreement in MLS yet? I checked last night and it wasn't. I'll check right now again.
Has it been blessed?
What?
Has it been blessed?
Yes, it's been blessed. So it has been approved. It's being pushed out to all the vendors. I'll warn you guys, it's not that different from what the current buyer brokerage agreement is. And that might be upsetting to some people, but it's basically the same thing as what's in there currently. Let's see, I'm looking at it right now. Buyer brokerage exclusive agreement.
Exclusives are good.
It is not on the NAR portal just yet. So I don't see it yet. So hopefully that helps. It will come out. It will come out probably this week. The classes at NAR are starting on the 29th, and then they're all through the first week of August as well. Multiple opportunities. It will be on Zoom eventually. So sign up for that, come to things like this, tear through it. Really what I think to me the most important thing is just hearing people talk about it.
Yeah.
How do I present it? How does my dad present it? How do your coworkers present it? I think that's a huge part of this. The forums, you're not going to have this like amazing revelation. It's going to be like, oh, this is kind of the same. It is. It's kind of the same form.
Tells differently, so you're going to present differently.
Sigrid says, in reality, how does it work? I have a client who wants to see a property in the next 24 hours. How can I clarify with the broker all the different problems which could come up? So in reality, what you would do, let's say it's a quick turnaround, you're going to have to get a buyer brokerage agreement signed in advance. And every broker is going to handle this a little bit differently. Some brokers are going to allow the agents to sign buyer brokerage agreements as long as they haven't been modified. So if you're just filling in the blanks and then signing it, they will authorize you to sign that buyer brokerage agreement on behalf of the broker. And that way, no one slows you down, other than maybe yourself and the buyer. But the broker won't get in the way if it's a quick turnaround. So, but your broker may not allow that. They may want to be more strict. And if the buyer is making modifications to the form, then certainly it's going to have to go in front of the broker.
The brokers have talked to, the other terms and conditions scares them, because you might have an agent write in something like, the compensation is whatever the seller's offering, which is a clear violation.
Right. And so in that scenario, the risk you run is that maybe the broker doesn't agree to get you paid. And that's a problem. Christina has a question. When can you amend a buyer brokerage form, mix forms, i.e. FAR bar with NABOR, NABOR with FAR bar. Yeah, you could do a NABOR buyer brokerage agreement and then make a FAR bar offer. You could do that, sales contract. That's not a problem. You could do a FAR buyer brokerage agreement and then do a NABOR sales contract with a FAR compensation agreement attached to it. That's not going to be a problem either. Keep in mind though, when you guys are trained, you are usually told, don't mix forms. That is like one of the big things that people will teach you. And there's a reason, because it's easy to mess it up. That the forms matter, words matter. And if you start mixing forms, you might mix the wrong form. So Dad, when you and I mix forms, what are we looking for? How do we verify that it's allowed?
We're looking for references to specific paragraphs. Let's say we're using the FAR buyer broker agreement. We're looking for specific references to the FAR sales contract that would not be in a NABOR contract.
Yeah.
We are looking for terms in the buyer broker agreement that would not be in the NABOR agreement. A classic example would be the difference between repair items and how they're defined between NABOR and FAR bar. You know, we have general repair items, and we have defective items, and they have general repair items. They have wood destroying organisms. They have permits, so they have different terms. So, you know, that's why we can use that FAR broker to broker agreement. There's no specific reference to terms within the FAR sales contract. There's no specific term that would make no sense with a NABOR contract.
Yeah, so be careful. Get it approved if you're going to mix forms, but it is possible. It is possible, but we have to read the forms. We have to make sure there are no references between the two that wouldn't make sense. Another example is the buyer election and seller response on a NABOR contract. You can't use it on a FAR bar, and you can't use it on an as is. That wouldn't make any sense. That would be a bad move. Eric says, if you have a buyer brokerage agreement signed at a certain amount, and that amount aligns with what the seller is offering, do you then modify your buyer brokerage agreement to put it to 0? Because the funds would all come from the seller instead. How's that going to work? I think that's a great question, because this is important. You do not modify your buyer brokerage agreement. Just because the seller is paying it, you still need that buyer brokerage agreement to match. So yes. The contract says the seller is paying X brokerage, you know, for the buyer at X amount, and your buyer brokerage agreement matches it. Now, the buyer brokerage agreement says that that's what you're owed, but that it doesn't have to come from the buyer. It may come from the cooperating agent. It may come from the seller. So you don't modify the buyer brokerage agreement. Don't make it anything less for that.
Yeah, doesn't matter where it's coming from. It just isn't more than that.
Right, exactly. So don't change that. Vicky reminds us the brokers that she works with are very hard and fast rule. Must be specific. So no ranges. And I think, again, every broker will be a little different. It's going to be a little bit of wild, wild west. I think there'll be some brokers that haven't been paying attention. And so I think you have to be specific. That's the advice I'm giving. Don't be the first one out there, just, again, wild, wild west, figuring it out.
You definitely have to be specific, but on the other hand, I think brokers are going to be a little liberal in the beginning, recognizing this is a learning curve. If there are sanctions, it won't be unlike what we see with Florida Real Estate Commission. You might get a warning that, hey, I know this is new, but you just got a slap on the wrist. Then you get a second offense, then you might get more than a slap on the wrist, and the third offense might be something else.
Yeah, exactly. So Mark had a couple of really wonderful questions. Mark, are you there?
I am.
All right, can you give it to me? We need to hear from you guys. So go ahead, tell me what you were thinking.
Well, first of all, while we were talking, I just read Mike Hughes's email this morning, and it said we need to start using the buyer broker agreements August 1st, not August 17th. So I guess he's made.
Yeah, can I talk to that real quick?
Yeah.
So under the NAR settlement, you don't need a buyer brokerage agreement until the 17th. But This is a good time to get that going because we're not going to be able to reference MLS at all. So even though you technically don't need a buyer brokerage agreement, you probably should, because you're not going to be able to do some sort of arbitration with NABOR or BAR or the Marco Island, because none of that information is going to be on MLS. So I think he's making a statement that, hey, we're going to require this because there's no other way for us to protect you.
Yeah, yeah.
Great point, Mike. Thank you.
Well, so, and again, I realize I'm not addressing the little questions or comments I put in there, but he's also stating, as far as the buyer broker agreement signed and dated, the buyer broker agreement must be explained and executed with the buyer prior to you working with them and showing them the property. The date of the buyer broker agreement cannot be after the date of the original offer that was entered into by the buyer. The rationale with this is that if you have a late day in the buyer broker agreement, they were not afforded the ability to negotiate the buyer broker comp before they submitted their offer. This could be a big and costly mistake. So that could clash a little bit with the discussion we had earlier about amending the buyer broker agreement and how Downing Fry in particular is going to handle that, with our brokerage.
Yeah, I think again, you got to double check with your broker before doing anything, because you don't want to assume that you're okay if the broker has a different interpretation. They're not just putting your license at risk, but they're putting their own. So they might have a very restrictive policy, or they might have a very loose policy, depending on where you're at.
The settlement agreement is real clear that you have to have a buyer broker agreement before you're working with and touring the property. Whether you amend it or not after the fact is something else. So, that's, I think, what he's trying to address, that you have something before you're working with, and that's the phrase they use, working
Well, and
with.
the other question is, Mark, how does your broker define, the timing of it? Will they accept a buyer brokerage agreement that is dated the same day as that initial offer? I think that's a very important question, because it can impact your strategy for how you interact with your customers.
Oh, absolutely. Great point. I mean, I had a long discussion yesterday with a gentleman I've been talking to for quite a while, and sending listings, and he called and said, okay, how is this going to work? Am I going to have to pay you? And, I spent about a half an hour kind of explaining to him, no, you won't have to pay. I mean, effectively, just as now, where there was listings at 3%, 2.5%, 2%, you don't see many below 2.5% unless you're talking about mega properties. Just as now, a good and ethical agent is saying, I'm not only showing you stuff based on me getting paid the full 3% and discarding other properties that are right for you. I'd rather sell you $1 million house and get paid 2% than not sell you that house and get paid nothing. And so, to my point here, if in fact the buyer broker agreements are amendable and you have that trust level with the people you're working with and they're convinced of your value, so why not say, hey, I'm going to sign up, we're going to sign this for 3%, but don't worry about you having to reach in your pocket to pay me a thing. When we get to the particular place that you're interested in, and I talk to that other agent and say, what, if anything, are you offering to me bringing a buyer? I will amend it down to that. And so if you go to contract with that, if they're paying 2.5% or 2%, that's what we'll change it to, and that will accept. You won't have to reach into your pocket to directly pay me anything, right? So there's another way to attack it if they're amendable.
So, Mark, you're just lower the amount that the buyer would offer to purchase the property. Am I hearing that correctly?
Well, it depends on what they're offering, right?
Depends on what they're offering.
If anything, see, this is the problem with the disconnect with sellers. So right now I've got $1 million listing. He's paying, let's just call it 5% to make the math easy. He's netting $950.
Right.
Now, if that seller says, well, I read in the paper the law changed, I don't have to, the buyer can pay his own broker, or agent. I'm not going to pay that anymore. I'm just going to
Right.
pay you, my seller's listing agent, 2.5%. My immediate response is going to be, okay, but your house is now listed for 975, not $1 million, right? Because guess what? They're not going to take an extra 25,000 out of your pocket. Your net didn't just increase because someone said that we're changing how we determine and advertise what we pay. The market price of your place didn't change. So that's where the disconnect is, I think, that we're all struggling with on both sides of this, to say, how do we communicate this and get back to, something that feels like the new normal?
Yeah, so here's my opinion on it. Number one, I initially thought that sellers would be reducing the sales price or the list price to accommodate not agreeing in advance to what the cooperating agent is getting. I'm like, all right, well, that makes perfect sense. If it was $1 million, I'm going to come down to 975 and I'm going to be more competitive. More buyers are going to see it. I'm going to be priced lower than my neighbors. Maybe that's the best solution. Realistically, like you said, Mark, that's not happening. Sellers aren't reducing their price. They're going to try and not pay it, right? They're going to try and put that in their own pocket. And as a listing agent, I think that's great. I think if you can get your seller to net more, this is a win for a seller and still a win for you. From a buyer's perspective, you just have to try and understand, well, what is the seller really expecting to net out of their deal? Did they ever change the price after this rule went into effect? If I call the listing agent, they say, oh, we're, built into the price, we're expecting to pay you X. Like, oh, well, that's helpful. So it hasn't exactly worked the way I was expecting initially, but that's normal. I think people are trying to keep things normal. Here's my one opinion on this, my one big opinion. What the seller is offering doesn't matter. I don't think it matters.
Well,
I don't care. I
question
don't care.
If people can understand that money is fungible, then that is true, right? So the guy writing the check has to determine what it's worth and what his net out of pocket's going to be. So if I can convince that buyer, hey, you're buying this house for 600,000 and you're writing me a check for 18,000, you're netting 618, that's just the same as before, where you would have had to pay 618 because the other guy's paying.
Totally. Yeah, it does make things a little bit more transparent for a buyer, but you have to explain it correctly. In fact, Mark, what I would say when a buyer asks you, am I going to have to pay this now? The answer is, well, yes and no. Say, look, technically, yes, you are obligating yourself to pay my fee, but just so you know, when we make our offers, we're going to always ask the seller to pay it. And if they refuse, we'll just offer less. So your net doesn't change. That's the important part is, yes, you may technically be paying it, but your net won't change. And that's how I've explained it. You can get out of that question pretty quickly in that scenario. And you tell them you don't have to pay it if you don't agree to pay it, right? You can, if we make an offer, the seller refuses, you refuse, guess what? We don't have a deal and you don't have a house. But if we can make it work, then you may end up paying it, but it won't really matter.
I think most people ask what their expenses are before they accept or make an offer anyways. So indirectly, it comes out of that same pot.
Yeah, you're going to want to do, we have on our website a fee calculator. You can do seller net sheets. You can include commissions. I'm asking my, the software company to modify their calculator to include this. So if your buyer wanted to estimate what the charges would be when they're paying your commission, that you'd be able to add that in and more easily just share that. It's not in there yet, but you can do that. So we're working in that way. Thanks, Mark, for putting that out there. I appreciate it. So if someone else was asking, they're like, why are we paying MLS fees? At the end of the day, MLS is still pretty powerful tool. It's the best tool we have to market a property for sale. And yes, it's going to make your job a lot harder. to, to stay in this industry and make a living. If you're representing a lot of buyers, it could make things a little harder. It adds a couple of steps. It's still the best tool we have. So until one of you creates something else that doesn't require, being a realtor or being involved in MLS, that's what we have to deal with. This is a package deal.
You need some sort of database on what's for sale.
Yeah, exactly. So hopefully that was helpful. Dad, you mentioned we have this this sheet here that I think is really neat. Let's see if I can pull it up on my screen. Tell us a little bit about this article. How can you explain it?
It's me looking around the computer for how this settlement agreement is going to work. Can you amend things? Can you amend the buyer broker? Can you amend the listing? More practical details than what we find in the settlement agreement. And I got this thing, which was a list of frequently asked questions from NAR, and it was circulated by the Emerald Coast Association of Realtors, but ultimately it came from NAR. And it got into when do you amend a buyer broker agreement? When do you amend a listing agreement? And it seemed like they were looking at the cutoff date as, when is a sales contract signed? Are you even bound by this? Well, if the sales contract predates the effective date of the settlement agreement, according to this, the answer is no. What about dual agents? What about open houses? So those practical details I found helpful.
Yeah, I put the link to the article in the chat. So if you want to click on that so that you have it before we sign off, you should do that. A couple of things I thought were really interesting. And this is really neat for a listing agent specifically. Here's my advice. If you are the listing agent and the buyer does not have an agent, then don't put your name on both sides. You are not doing both sides. You are only the listing agent, and therefore you are not working with the buyer. You are only the listing agent. You are not working with the buyer. You would not need a buyer brokerage agreement. Your listing agreement states how much you are paid. And because there is no other agent, you're not having to share any of that with another agent. So that is a practice change that I would highly recommend you look at. Do not put yourself on both sides unless you have a buyer brokerage agreement and a listing agreement.
Christian, would you think they're better off just staying a single agent?
As opposed to transactional?
Yeah.
Well, most people are transactional by default. And I don't think it's a problem to be transactional unless that is how you sold your services to the seller. If you are single agent, then I don't think it matters. You have different levels of confidentiality. There are different duties with single agent transactional. But I think you could probably stay a transactional agent and just be on one side, and it would be okay. Judy asked, did I miss where the co-broke will be shared? We need to call each listing agent first. Yeah, we will need to call each listing agent first if you haven't already signed a buyer brokerage agreement. And this is again something that is going to change us. And to me, the simplest way to think about it is once I agree to a number with my buyer, I'm not going to amend it. That is the simplest way. You and I are going to talk about what I'm charging, and that's what I charge. And if you do it that way, you don't really need to call the listing agent before making an offer. The listing agent might not answer your call. They might say some vague answer like, well, just put it in your offer. Or they might give it to you specific, but you don't have to do it. If you and the buyer are okay with what you're getting paid, it's in writing and signed, then just make your offer. Make your offer, ask the seller to pay that amount, and you'll get paid. I think calling the listing agent and verifying, like if you're calling new construction and say, hey, are you offering a bonus this week? You'd have to amend your buyer brokerage agreement at that point, or it would have to be already included. So
what do you think would apply better, Christian? Using the FAR addendum that the seller broker will pay the buyer broker your fee, or just offering less money? Which one do you think?
I think it depends on how sophisticated your buyer is. The reality is most buyers or sellers have an understanding of what it should be. And I
Yeah.
don't want to rock the boat unnecessarily. So if your buyer, if you went into it like Mark
Right.
said, and you're telling them, oh, you're not going to have to pay it, don't worry, then include it in the offer. Reduce the purchase price if there's an excess, or ask for a credit. Say, I want you to pay my agent 2%, and I want you to pay the buyer 1% as a credit. And then the listing agent will take it and be like, oh, well, that's what we were looking for. We were offering that, and now the buyer gets a little extra money in their pocket. Or you offer a little less. But I think you got to be just, this is what I charge, and then move on. I wouldn't.
You're not rocking the boat, basically. They
Don't rock
proceed
the boat.
that way anyway, so you're not changing their perception, even though the reality is exactly the same as offering less money.
Yeah. Someone else says you need to know if a seller is not paying commission prior to showing that property. Is the cost to buyers X more than the list price? Maybe. It all depends. I mean, honestly, the list price is helpful information because it's showing kind of what the seller is expecting. But you guys are going to run a market analysis on every property before you make your offer. You're going to tell the buyer, hey, we think it's worth about what they're asking, but only if they're also paying the compensation. Or, hey, this is a pretty low price. They may not be offering compensation. We can ask for it, but if they come back, that's still a good deal. So the list price, it matters a little bit. It's a factor, but it's not as much as comps, not as much as the buyer's willing to pay. That stuff matters a lot more than the list price. I do think there are going to be a lot of, and there are a lot of listing agents who don't answer the phone, or that you want to make a competitive offer really quick and you can't get them. You're going to have to do it a little blind, and that's okay. We'll have to see what happens. Eric says, is identifying properties different than touring a property when defining working with a buyer? Specifically, auto emails sent to buyers via MLS. Do those potential buyers need a buyer brokerage agreement? You guys will have to figure that out a little bit on your own, but I will give you my opinion. In my opinion, it's showing the property that matters. It's just sharing it with them. That's not enough, and it really can't be policed. Your broker doesn't know if you've been sending them emails for the last 6 months or the last 6 hours. I think what they're going to look at is, was the buyer brokerage agreement signed prior to the first offer? And if that's the case, then, what else could they know?
Yeah, it comes down to what working with the buyer means in the settlement agreement. A Zoom tour, NAR says, yeah, you're working with the buyer. There's a lot of wiggle room, and it's in that material that you're attaching to this anyways, on the 2 requirements of working with and touring the home.
Yeah, what does it mean to tour a home? Written buyer agreements are required before a buyer tours a home for sale listed on the MLS. Touring a home means when the buyer and/or MLS participant or other agent at the direction enters the house. This includes when MLS participant or other agent at the direction that enters the home to provide a live virtual tour to a buyer not physically present. So
Yeah.
a Zoom tour or FaceTime would include touring. A home means residential property consisting of not less than 4 residential units. So that's touring a home. I mean, I think if you want to be safe, just get everyone to sign one. If they're on your email list, just have it in your file. It's probably overkill. I'd say in the very least, before you actually show them a house, get this signed. And if it expires, get another one signed, amendment, all those things, but double check with your broker. So Allison says, you cannot use the following words in MLS according to her broker: bonus, commission, compensation, concessions, consideration, payment, percentage, remuneration, stipend, incentive, and credit. So that would be in any field, including private remarks. So I think the thing to learn is that try not to skirt this. Just be super clean. Put out your listing, and if someone calls you saying what the seller is willing to offer, just tell them the truth. But if you can't put it in MLS, you can't disguise it, you can't upload a document that includes a compensation agreement with a percentage back to the buyer agent. Don't do any of those things. Just do it super clean until we, you know, kind of figure out how this is all going to work. And price your properties to sell, you know, price them to sell. Right. And if you think including a commission on there is pricing it to sell and marketing, then that's what you got to do. Don says, what happens when the deal, and I'm gonna go a little bit longer than normal just so that I can get to these questions. What happens when the deal falls through because the seller and buyer could not agree to the buyer's fee? If the buyer cannot afford the fee with that particular home, is the buyer's agent liable in a lawsuit? I think you just don't have a deal. And it's no different than disagreeing over the sales price of the home. You know, in a sales price, I'll give you a different example. In FAR contracts, there's a checkbox for who pays for title insurance. So you make an offer for $1 million, but you want the seller to pay title insurance. And the buyer's like, no, I will only do the $1 million if, you know, or maybe it's the opposite. You know, I'll do less if the buyer has to pay it, and I'll do more if the seller is paying it. You know, and they just can't get on the same page. They're both fighting over $1 million, but one's paying it and one's not paying it. That's all. That you don't have a deal. You don't have a deal in that case. You got to keep working it to see if there is a solution, or buyer might have to go somewhere else.
It'd be like you and I getting sued because we wouldn't work for free.
Right.
You know,
so there's no liability. The buyer agreed to your amount up front.
Yes.
Maybe the big learning lesson in that one, Dad, is if you don't have them agree to your fee up front, right? Let's say, you know, they don't tour the property. They just want to make a blind offer. Right. And you're like, well, I called the listing agent. They said that they will offer 1. I really want you to offer 2. And the buyer throws you under the bus. Hey, you never got a buyer brokerage agreement signed. You know, if you don't step away, then I'm going to sue you and you're going to get exposed. I think that's a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem.
I think you cannot expose yourself by not doing a buyer brokerage agreement up front. You can do it up front and make sure that the buyer can't throw you under the bus for that reason.
Which they will in a heartbeat. I mean, you know, when it comes to money, people change quite quickly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Christina, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. This is not regarding MLS. This is not regarding any supplements, anything to do with MLS whatsoever. This is regarding our verbal conversations with buyers and sellers, but especially with buyers when we're talking about how we're going to be compensated. So should we be using the word compensating and not ever using the word commission? Is it still okay to use the word commission when we're having a verbal conversation? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
It is commission. All the forms have been modified to say compensation because they're so afraid of being sued for manipulating buyers and sellers. Dad, do you remember if it says something specifically about how we can define compensation? I don't think there's any problem with it, especially verbally.
Compensation, because that's the word they use in the settlement agreement, but it's not. The settlement agreement doesn't make it mandatory that you use that exact word.
Right. So you're okay to kind of define compensation in that way, but the forms itself do use the words compensation, and that's what we should stick to.
The thing this might affect it somewhat. The litigators in this situation, the antitrust lawyers in this situation, they're not real estate people. They're not realtors. They're not real estate lawyers. So there might not be the exact verbiage that you and I would use on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
You know, they're antitrust lawyers. You know, they go after all sorts of industries.
Yeah.
So
yeah, good question, Christina. Thank you. So Sigrid asked a question, and actually it's in this form that I shared with you. Let's see if I can highlight it for us. It basically says, are written buyer agreements required when listing agents talk to a buyer on behalf of a seller or only a sub-agent? Is that what I was looking at? Oh, here it is. Both of these. Let's look at both of them. The first one on the top, if an MLS participant hosts an open house or provides access to a property on behalf of the seller only to an unrepresented buyer, will they be required to enter into a written agreement with those buyers touring the home? No, only if you are wanting to get paid by that buyer or as the buyer's broker, would you need a buyer brokerage agreement? So in that scenario, if you are the listing agent, just don't put yourself on both sides. You are only representing the seller, and your listing agreement will have you get paid whatever your listing agreement says. If you're also wanting to get paid as the buyer's broker, then yes, you would need a buyer brokerage agreement. But open house, have them. I don't think it changes anything. And if that buyer wants to work with you going forward, have them sign a buyer brokerage agreement.
This thing we're attaching to this, Christian, refers to dual agency, which we don't have in Florida. And we run into the reality of, and all realtors have run into this, even when there is an agent on the other side, you might have an inexperienced agent and you get the one agent who's doing 99% of the work because they have the experience and they want to get the deal done and they want to get it closed. So, yeah, I'm worried more like with situations where if there is nobody on the other side, you're gonna have to do something or the deal isn't gonna close. I mean, they're
Yeah.
totally ignorant. They have no clue.
Yeah. So Joyce wrote this, and I've said it before, embrace the change. I love buyer broker agreements because I have been burned after months of showings with DF Downing Fry being 100% in the softer market getting, no one paid you to say this, Joyce, being a softer market at 3% and you offer the seller 2% if you get both sides, and offer nothing on the buyer side, but tell them you're open to commission and put it in the offer. I like that last sentence even more. Offer nothing on the buyer side, but tell them you are open to commission and to put it in their offer. And I've talked about that before. I would say most listing agents don't want to do that. The ones that I've talked with, they want to kind of negotiate their listing agreements in the same way we've always done them, where it says, here's what I'm going to charge, and I'm going to split half of it with the buyer's broker if there is one, or if they ask. So if that's the case, you want to do that. I think most people will do that. And if you call that listing agent, they'll tell you, hey, we're offering this, we're offering that. But another option is what Joyce is promoting, which is when you negotiate a listing agreement, just put what you're charging and put the cooperating split as 0. And when they call and they say, what are you offering? You say, hey, look, the seller and I discussed it, but just include it in your offer. You know, it's how you present it that matters. I wouldn't say nothing. I would say, hey, we are open to paying a cooperating split, included in your offer, whatever it needs to be. I think that's a wonderful model. I don't know if listing agents are going to jump to that because most people have said they don't love that. Would it be legal if the listing agent charges 4 and credit to the buyer 2 at closing? Yeah. The listing agent can give a credit to a buyer. They can give a credit to a buyer's broker only if the buyer's broker has a buyer brokerage agreement. So
we got the standard buyer credit for closing costs, prepaids and escrows. We got buyer credits for repair items.
Yeah, I'd say honestly, the biggest issue I'm going to see is when you're expecting to get paid as a buyer broker and you didn't have an agreement. The seller agreed to it, the listing agent agreed to it, but if the buyer didn't agree to it, or if they agreed to it after you went under contract, I don't think you'll get paid. Mary asked a great question. She says, is your firm, Ross Title, anticipating writing and negotiating more real estate contracts? We do this pretty rarely currently. You know, I call them FSBOs, for sale by owner. We probably do, I don't know, 2 or 3 a month. It's not a huge part of our business. It's a lot of freaking work. You guys earn every penny that you make. I really am not looking forward to any of that. But
I never like doing them, Christian.
it's so much work. And what I tell buyers is I say, look, you're going to want to talk at 10 p.m. at night because, you know, this inspection issue and the mortgage. And I'm like, I don't want to talk to you. You know, I'm going to be home. Call a realtor, right? Call a realtor. That you guys are paid to be available, you know, at that level where we have to spread ourselves a lot thinner. You know, if we're doing 100 closings, we can't spend 2 hours on the phone with every one of them. It's just not realistic. So if we are asked to do this, we will have to charge. And I just don't know if I'm up for that. You know, we would
I
have
think
to staff
our-
differently, and
There's not enough time to service everybody the way the realtors do.
there isn't. I think what I would do is jump in front of me, take that business from me, be a great listing agent, be someone that says, hey, you know, why don't I help you put this together? Let me answer your questions. Let's see if I can, you know, less cooks in the kitchens. Let's see if I can do this for you. And then, oh, by the way, go hire Christian to double check the contract because I can't give you legal advice. And that way the buyer can save a little money, maybe you can make more money, and then I can be involved in the way that I want to be involved. But if we do see more buyers asking us to draft contracts, I don't know, we'll have to see.
Look at repairs alone, Christian. I mean, we get questions once in a while when there's a conflict between two sides, but we don't do it for every single deal. If we had to go through the whole inspection explanation of how it works under the NAR contract for every single deal, I mean, there's not enough hours in the week.
Yeah, Sheree asks, do we provide services for owner financing? We do. Honestly, we love doing all this stuff. I really get into it. I draft notes and mortgages and easements and encroachment agreements. I don't charge attorneys fees. We like doing flat fee deals with title insurance. We want everyone to be as happy as possible, and I want to make sure the realtor has a place in that. But if, you know, the real value add that we have is call me as much as you want. You know, not every deal requires us to be on speed dial, but I give out my cell phone for a reason. You know, I took it after you, Dad. You had your cell phone and your business card for 30 years. I do the same. Everyone has it. If you need something immediately, text me. But if someone were to abuse it or something, it's actually easier for me to block your number if it's my cell phone. So, just a warning. But I love working with you guys. And if this changes my business drastically, I'm not going to want that either. I really want to make sure that you guys continue to bring us deals and you service the clients, and then I service you. Let us help you be the best that you can be. Christina, you had another point that you wanted to bring up?
Oh, hi. I hope that wasn't directed to me blocking.
Yeah, let me unblock you real quick.
Yeah, thank you. I think it was Joyce that was speaking to, and you were talking about putting in your listing agreement your amount that you're asking for as a listing agent, and then zero what you're giving, and then having negotiations. It will be interesting to see, I guess, the kickback that we might receive from buying agents. Like, let's say we were agreeing to the 3 bananas that we talk about. And then all of a sudden they're negotiating, right? But they negotiated only 2. So then all of a sudden it's not an equal split. I have a feeling that a lot of buying agents might be a little bit upset once they see that on the Alta statement, like, hey, you got 3, but my answer would be, well, that's what you negotiated, and this is what I negotiated. But I can see there being some, upsetting conversations where we might want to, at that point, say, well, you know what? I'll give you X amount of mine.
Yeah, so this is something we have to get over. Right now, it does still happen where the either listing agent's making more or the selling agent's making more, and it does add to this friction. There's a realtor that I've been working with recently. He's not on right now, but he learned the hard way. He negotiated something with his buyer to just draft the contract. This is a great lesson for him, and he continues to remind me, and hopefully it'll be a good lesson for you guys. If you negotiate a flat fee, low price, and then just to make the offer, put the contract together, write the offer, and then you're supposed to be able to go back to the pool. That didn't happen in his deal. In his deal, what ended up happening is he makes this offer, the buyer says, okay, he gives him a deal because he's also selling the house, and he's like, all right, this is going to be a long-time client. And that deal ended up being a disaster. In fact, it closed yesterday night, like at the 11th hour, just barely. And the buyer's agent were like, man, this was a lesson. I was like, I need to be all the way in or all the way out. And that's how we feel. Someone asked me recently, hey, can you represent the seller? And I said, yeah, I'd be happy to. Here's what we charge. And they say, oh my gosh, we're not going to pay that. We just want you to draft the deed. And we thought maybe it'd be like $100.
It never
I said,
happened.
you know, I said respectfully, the way we do business, we're either all the way in or we're all the way out. We can't afford to just be 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And that's the best advice I can give you. Find out what your value is, price your services accordingly, and stick to your guns. You know, if, you know, don't overextend yourself. Don't think that you're worth, you know, way up here. Like, you really want to value your services where you get enough business that you can support your lifestyle and really, you know, motivate you to do great. But don't undercut your services. Don't devalue your services. You've got to be straight with it. So I'm going to share the listing agreement with us. Again, this is the old one. This has not been updated, but it's the new one's going to look the same. They're just changing a couple of the words. Like, instead of calling it a cooperating selling agent or something, they're calling it something else. But what they're saying is, you put in here, you know, what you're charging. So let's say you put a percentage of the gross, actually it's going to be up here. So percentage of the purchase price, which is what you would normally do. And then down here under the cooperating, you put here. So cooperating broker compensation, this term will change in the new form, but it's otherwise going to look the same. If buyer agents and brokers, even if compensated by broker or seller, that buyer brokerage may represent the interests of a buyer upon receipt of buyer of the compensation provided in the paragraph above, broker shall pay to any such cooperating broker any such amount, a percentage, with broker retaining the balance of total compensation to be paid by seller set forth herein. So what they're saying is, all right, let's put 0 here on line 136. And I'm going to put my amount up here on line 122. You can do that. You're not going to be putting it in MLS anyways. You may or may not be putting it on, you know, your website or in flyers. You know, you could put it in a flyer. Hey, we're offering a percentage split. You could do that, but just not in MLS. So if you're really not promoting that very much, if you're not able to promote it, maybe you do, you know, your percentage and then a 0, and then you say, hey, you know, included in your offer, we'll consider all options. You know, it does work that way. It would work fine. The only other way to think about it, if you did that, and I don't know if this is easier or if it's harder than the way it's done currently, but in other terms and conditions, I would say something along the lines of, if buyer is unrepresented by a broker, then listing agent shall receive an additional 1%. That's what I like. So right now we start at a high number, and if there's no buyer broker, well, then we'll reduce it a certain amount. That's some of your broker listing agreements say that. What I'm suggesting, if you're going to go the other route, if you're going to start with just what you're paid, but a buyer doesn't have an agent, then I'm going to charge more because it's more work. You know, and I think you can easily explain that to a seller. So it would be the only suggestion. If you go what Joyce was suggesting and what Christina is kind of thinking about, you start low. Well, make sure you put a little escalation clause in there for the listing agent. You could do that, right, Dad? An escalation clause here saying if the buyer is unrepresented.
Point out to the owner that if there is no broker on the other side, you're doing twice the work.
That's what we like to say. And you can charge it however you think, however you think you need to charge it. You could do that. You know, there's one other question, and then I think we'll end it because it's been, you know, you guys have been wonderful. You guys are awesome. Here's the last question. If, oh gosh, no, I just had a brain fart. I guess this is a long call. All right.
Not you.
Yeah, it couldn't be me. Listing agent, I don't know. Dad, you have any other topics? Maybe it'll come to me.
Meaning of life. Nope, I'm done.
All right. Well, we'll just end it at that. I'm sure I'll have something else to talk about. But so August 1st, these rules will change. You will not see MLS disclosing any cooperating splits. Those fields will go away. There's not going to be a concession field or anything like that. So get familiar with the forms as they come out this week. Call or email me if you have questions. I'd be happy to help. We're definitely trying to make sure that you guys stay focused on what's important. And the most important thing is, if you're paid by a buyer, you got to get that buyer brokerage agreement signed before you make an offer. That's the best way to protect yourself. Technically, it's before you show a property. So hopefully that works. Thank you, everyone, for your support. And we will see you on the next video. Good luck.